But, you know, Mika, it was that sort of discipline that actually made your father a very big fan of George H.W. Bush. And I would say you could count the number of Republicans that your father voted for on one hand. You actually could count the number of Republicans your father voted for president on one finger. And that one president was George H.W. Bush.
Yeah, and there's so much news to cover, but it's hard not to recognize that the passing of George H.W. Bush has rekindled bipartisan good feeling on editorial pages and just about anywhere else that politics is spoken. President Bush's death also has done what many previously believed was impossible. It's inspired the current occupant of the White House to briefly behave in a way that's presidential, with gracious words and a declaration of an extended period of national mourning. But what becomes undeniably obvious with every bio run about Bush 41 is that stark contrast between these two men. Bush served in the military, treated people with respect and dignity, and put country ahead of party and self time and time again over his half-century in public service, half-century. Over the last 2 years, deviancy has continued being defined down by this current president, his cronies, his supporters, who love telling reporters that they don't care how deviant his behavior becomes. Let's see what happens at Wednesday's memorial service. My prediction is that Trump fakes more respect for families whose unprecedented history of public service has repeatedly belittled. Then he goes back to making a mockery of the very office George Bush and this nation long revered. Just as President Bush's character was set even during his earliest days at Andover with the stories that you all have told, Donald Trump remains the man, think about this, the man he was while avoiding the draft, and then telling Howard Stern on the radio that sleeping around with women in New York City while avoiding sexual diseases was his own personal Vietnam. He said that. As is always the case, the presidency does not shape character. It reveals it in a raw fashion. And that is why we celebrate George H.W. Bush's legacy and fear the next 2 years of Mr. Trump's wild White House ride. And as we continue to watch that, Andrea, it's conduct in office that we look at today with President Trump, and we look at over the past few days even, which leaves our jaws dropping.
Well, certainly in personal and political and foreign policy and relations with the media, the contrast could not be more stark. You have President Trump returning from a G20 where he couldn't meet with Vladimir Putin for a variety of reasons. They said it was because of Ukraine, but perhaps it would have been better to meet with him and stand up to him and publicly stand up to him on Ukraine rather than just avoiding the whole subject. And the obvious implication was that he couldn't meet with him because of the plea agreement just hours earlier before departing of Michael Cohen. So all of that brought into gross relief, as well as that extraordinary handshake, hand grip, bromance between the two strongmen who are sort of the bookends of the Trump foreign policy. You know, so many thoughts flood over me about George H.W. Bush and the years and years of watching him in so many roles. The political role, which people have acknowledged. 1988 was a brutal campaign. Lee Atwater's deathbed confessions for the Willie Horton ads and other things that transpired. But the contrast between that and the tough decisions he made, John Meacham referring to that tough budget decision, which did set the stage for years and years of prosperity, as well as some of the other decisions that he made that contradicted his own previous, more political impulses. He always, however, with Maureen Dowd and with others, I'm thinking of Peter Baker's reminiscence about Ann Devroy, the late, great White House correspondent from the Washington Post, who led to the demise of John Sununu, her own reporting. And when she got sick with cancer, the first person to respond was President Bush. She had absolutely bedeviled him. And he and Jim Baker got her into MD Anderson for intensive treatments. Tragically did not save her young life, but they did everything they could in Houston to help her. And it could not have been a more dramatic contrast, because she was the toughest White House correspondent. Maureen was really the toughest columnist. but there's so many other examples. Marlin Fitzwater really represented the balance and the spirit of President Bush 41 in terms of his role as press secretary. The contrast could not be more stark with what we see today.
Absolutely.
Jon Meacham,
Absolutely.
we are possibly going to be seeing on Wednesday Act Two in a remarkable public play where we move from a McCain funeral, the John McCain funeral, which was unlike anything that either Mika or I have ever seen in our life, a coming together basically of leaders celebrating what Washington once was and what people believed Washington could be again. And I can't help but believe that's what we're going to see on Wednesday as well. Republicans and Democrats and independents and others saying, this is who we have been, this is who we will be again. I suspect we may leave with many of the same feelings on Wednesday that we did after the John McCain funeral.
Oh, absolutely. I think it will end up being, I think the cumulative effect of the week is going to be reminiscence and, let's hope, a celebration, not an internment, of an American order that looked outward to the world, did not look inward in an isolationist way. I mean, this will be about global engagement. It's going to be about free trade. It's going to be about an America where we understand that if we aren't involved in the affairs of the world, young men like George H.W. Bush end up getting shot down out of the sky, because that was the price of the isolationism of the 1920s and 30s. I want to mention two names here because I think President Bush would want us to. From September 2nd, 1944, the day he was shot down in the Pacific, every day he thought about Ted White and Dell Delaney, who were the two crewmates who died on that mission with him over at Chichijima. He always wondered why he was spared. My own view of his life is that in many ways, every subsequent day was an attempt to prove himself worthy of having been spared on that day. He understood that his life was no longer his own. He heard his mother's voice, his father's example, always about to whom much is given, much is expected. And we can praise him, and we will praise him without romanticizing him. He was a flawed figure. The first person to tell you that would be Barbara Bush, and the second would be Bush himself. But I think his flaws make him more interesting and actually make this week more important to us culturally, because if somebody flawed can do the great things he did, then perhaps all of us who are as flawed as you can imagine can do the same thing going forward.
Well, still ahead on Morning Joe, details on why the CIA believes Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman probably ordered the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. A new Wall Street Journal piece undercuts the president's stance on Saudi Arabia.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.